Imagine looking at a country that sits near the very bottom of the global human development rankings. Like, out of the entire world, you're looking at a nation ranked 153rd.
Right, way down at the bottom of the list.
Yeah, exactly. Now imagine we suddenly change the rules of the entire global ranking system. Instead of just looking at wealth, health, and education, we introduce a penalty.
And a really heavy, mathematically unforgiving penalty at that.
Oh, absolutely. A penalty for any country that destroys the environment to achieve its wealth. And suddenly, in the blink of an eye, this supposedly underdeveloped, struggling country rockets up the global charts by 8 full spots.
While at the exact same time, some of the wealthiest, most advanced nations on Earth just plummet down the list.
Right, and that country is Zimbabwe. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are tearing open 3 decades of rigorous global development data to figure out exactly how economic struggle suddenly became the gold standard for ecological salvation.
It really is a wild shift.
It is. We have a massive research report covering the years 1990 to 2023, specifically looking at Zimbabwe and the world human development footprint. And I gotta say, the numbers in here are going to challenge everything you think you know about global progress.
They really do. I mean, it forces a complete inversion of how we typically measure success. The countries we usually look to as the absolute pinnacle of progress suddenly look, well, deeply flawed under this new lens.
Yeah, and then a nation struggling with profound systemic poverty suddenly looks like a pioneer.
Exactly. We are using Zimbabwe today not just as a case study, but as a mirror held up to the entire globe's definition of development.
Because the core mystery we have to solve today for you, the listener, is how economic backwardness somehow translates into an environmental triumph. And we have to ask the hard questions about the survival games hidden behind this so-called green development.
Which means we are going to be diving into some pretty dense UN indices today.
We are, but I want to make sure we keep this grounded. These aren't just spreadsheets. These data points represent millions of human lives. So before we get into the paradox itself, I want to make sure I'm fully grasping the framework of this report.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, so we have 4 main pillars of data here, and I want to try synthesizing them to make sure we have a solid map for the deep dive.
Please do. It's crucial we have the baseline clear before we look at the anomalies.
Okay, so the first pillar is the HDI, the Human Development Index. From what I gather, this is essentially the baseline measurement of growth, right?
Yes, exactly.
It tracks life expectancy, education, and standard of living. It basically tells us the sheer size of a country's developmental engine.
That is a really solid way to look at it. It measures potential and overall capacity. Then the second pillar is the IHDI, which stands for the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index.
Right, so if the HDI is the size of the engine, the IHDI adjusts that score based on who actually gets the keys to the car.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks. It measures how health, education, and income are actually distributed. It gives us the lived reality for the average person on the ground, minus the distortion of extreme wealth at the very top.
You've hit the nail on the head. And then the third pillar narrows that focus even further, the GII, or Gender Inequality Index.
Which measures the fairness of that growth, right?
Yeah.
Specifically through the lens of gender.
Right. Looking at reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation, it answers a vital macroeconomic question. Are women and men sharing equally in the nation's development, or is a massive segment of the population being structurally sidelined?
And I was looking over that data on that front before we started recording, and the bottlenecks there are incredibly stark. We will definitely be digging into that later.
Absolutely will.
Finally, the fourth pillar, which creates that massive ranking jump we talked about in the hook, is the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
Right, the environmental filter.
Yeah. This factors in a country's carbon dioxide emissions and its material footprint. It basically measures whether a country's growth is actually sustainable or if it's just, borrowing against the Earth's future.
So we have the baseline, the reality, the fairness, and the sustainability. And as we move through these metrics, I want you to keep the human element at the forefront.
Always.
Because we are tracking a society that has navigated intense systemic shocks over 33 years. To understand where they are in 2023, we have to start by looking at the baseline trajectory. We need to plot the HDI from 1990 to today.
Yeah, and when I first pulled up the HDI graph, comparing the global average to Zimbabwe, the visual contrast actually made me do a double take.
It is pretty jarring.
It really is. If you chart the Global Human Development Index from 1990, when it sat at 0.608, to 2023, when it reached 0.756, it is a remarkably steady climb. Year over year, The world just slowly gets healthier, wealthier, and more educated.
Right. It is a consistent, almost uninterrupted upward slope, and that reflects a general global consensus on poverty reduction and technological expansion over the last 30 years.
But Zimbabwe's HDI chart doesn't look like that at all. It forms this massive, terrifying U-shape.
A very steep U shape.
Yeah. In 1990, their HDI was zero point 0.5 under zero, which, is a decent starting point for a developing nation at the time. But instead of joining the global climb, the number completely collapses.
It just falls off a cliff.
It drops to 0.487 by 1992, hits 0.472 by 1996, and just keeps falling until it reaches a devastating historic low of 0.450 in the year 2003.
It represents an entirely lost decade. More than a decade, in fact. The recovery from that 2003 nadir was grueling.
I can imagine.
It took until roughly 2010 just to claw back above their 1990 starting line to reach 0.512. And then by 2023, they managed to reach 0.598. So you have a plunge, a total bottoming out, and a 2-decade climb back to stability.
But, a chart dropping from 0.5 under zero to 0.450 doesn't really convey the trauma of what actually happened. We have to isolate the variables inside the HDI to figure out what caused the plunge.
Exactly, you have to look under the hood.
And when you look at the submetrics, it wasn't a slow economic decline that caused this. It was an absolute catastrophic collapse in the health dimension.
The data on life expectancy during this period is, frankly, difficult to even process.
Yes, grim.
In 1990, the life expectancy in Zimbabwe was 58.3 years, which wasn't incredibly far off from the global average of 65.1 years at the time. There was a gap, but it was a bridgeable gap.
But then you fast forward to the year 2001. The global average life expectancy had crept up to 67.9 years. But in Zimbabwe, life expectancy plummeted to an average of just 44.5 years.
That's a staggering drop.
I had to sit with that number for a minute. 44.5 years. I mean, I'm in my early 40s right now. The idea that statistically my life would be overtapped? How does a society even function, economically or culturally, when the average lifespan is cut off before 45?
The macroeconomic implications are massive. What you are describing is a demographic hollowing out. When the average life ends in the mid-40s, you lose the foundational pillars of a functioning economy.
You lose the institutional memory.
Precisely.
If the experienced managers, the senior teachers, the master tradespeople are all gone, who trains the next generation?
Nobody. Furthermore, you have a massive surge in orphaned children, which places an unbearable strain on the extended family structure and whatever social safety nets might exist.
Right, because the parents are gone.
Yes. Parents are lost during their peak earning years, meaning wealth accumulation stops dead in its tracks. And from a strictly public infrastructure standpoint, the healthcare system ceases to be about preventative care or long-term wellness.
It just becomes pure triage.
Exactly. It becomes entirely consumed by crisis management.
And this wasn't just a single bad year. The life expectancy hovered in the mid-40s from 1998 all the way to 2004. But the U-shape of the overall HDI implies a recovery. And looking at the health data post-2005, the resilience of the population is undeniable.
The velocity of the recovery is what really stands out in the report. We see a sharp V-shaped rebound in the health data. By 2015, life expectancy climbed back up to 59.5 years.
Wow, that's a fast climb.
And by 2023, it reached 62.7 years.
They basically added nearly 2 decades back to the average lifespan in the span of 20 years. Now, obviously, 62.7 years is still significantly below the 2023 global average of 73.4 years.
Right, the gap is still very much there.
But the sheer survival effort required to close that massive deficit from the early 2000s is incredible.
It is a profound demonstration of a society pulling itself back from the brink. However, this raises a major analytical contradiction.
Oh, how so?
Well, if a country's health infrastructure collapses that severely in the 90s and early 2000s, standard economic models dictate that all other civic institutions should crumble alongside it.
Right. I mean, if a government is fighting just to keep its workforce alive past the age of 44, they aren't exactly pouring money into building new schools or training new educators. Education is usually the first casualty of a national survival crisis.
That is what the models predict, yes. But the data here violently rejects that assumption.
Yeah, this was actually the single most surprising statistic I found in the entire 1990 to 2023 data set. We're going to look at the mean years of schooling, which measures the average number of years of formal education received by people ages 25 and older.
A very crucial metric.
So if you pull up the global average for 2023, the world sits at 8.775 years of schooling.
Keep that global benchmark in mind, listeners. 8.775 years.
Now, despite the economic freefall, despite the life expectancy dropping to 44.5 years in 2001, and despite that grueling two-decade recovery, Zimbabwe's mean years of schooling in 2023 is 8.931 years.
That really deserves a pause. Zimbabwe, a nation ranked 153rd out of 193 countries in overall human development, actually surpasses the global average in educational stock.
They literally beat the world average. And it's not a recent phenomenon either. If you track the historical data, they've been building this intellectual stockpile straight through the crisis.
Yes, the historical data is fascinating here.
In 1990, their mean years of schooling was 5.02. By 2000, right in the absolute darkest depths of the health crisis, it actually increased to 6.55.
And by 2010, it was 7.66.
The education system just kept expanding stubbornly while the rest of the country was in emergency mode.
To contextualize how bizarre this is, development economists use a framework called global quadrants to map national progress.
Okay, break that down for us.
You plot a country's education level on the y-axis and their income level on the x-axis. The vast majority of nations with low overall HDI scores cluster tightly in the low education, low income quadrant.
Which makes grim mathematical sense. Poor countries don't have the tax base to fund widespread education.
Right.
Which leaves the population without the advanced skills needed to build high-yield industries, which in turn keeps the country poor. It is a locked cycle.
Exactly. But Zimbabwe completely breaks the model. On the global map, they are an extreme outlier, sitting virtually alone in a high education, low income translation position. They possess the intellectual layout of a highly advanced transitioning economy, but they are trapped inside the financial reality of a struggling one.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the cultural commitment required to achieve that. To keep an education system functioning and expanding while the economy fractures around you requires an incredible level of community prioritization.
It absolutely does.
It represents millions of people who can read, perform complex mathematics, and analyze information. It is an intellectual stockpile.
Right.
You essentially have a massive high-performance engine that has been built and fueled up, but it's just sitting idle.
Which naturally leads us to the critical, frustrating question of this report. Where is the spark?
Yeah, why isn't it running?
Exactly. If you have a highly educated population whose health is recovering, why is the economy still stagnant? Why is the HDI still lagging so far behind the world?
To figure that out, we have to pivot from the intellectual stockpile to the economic bottleneck.
Yeah.
We have to look at the income gap and, critically, how the wealth that does exist is actually distributed.
Because the numbers here are as extreme as the education numbers, just in the opposite direction.
Yeah, they really are. Let's examine the gross national income per capita, or GNI. This measures the total domestic and foreign output claimed by residents of a country divided by the population.
Now, wait, let me pause you there. The report mentions that this GNI is adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Oh, right. Good catch.
Just so we don't lose anyone in the economics jargon, can we decode that? You mean adjusting the numbers so we account for the fact that a US dollar buys a lot more groceries in Harare than it does in New York, right?
Precisely. If we just used raw exchange rates, the comparison would be useless because the cost of living varies so wildly. PPP adjusts the data by looking at a standard basket of goods like bread, housing, basic services, and equalizes the currency values based on what they can actually buy locally.
Right, so it levels the playing field.
Exactly. So when we compare these numbers globally, we are comparing actual equivalent living standards.
Perfect. So looking at the 2023 data adjusted for purchasing power parity, the world average GNI per capita is roughly $20,327.
Okay.
But Zimbabwe's GNI per capita in 2023 is $3,511.
The disparity is massive. And if we look back at the historical context, during the absolute lowest point of that U-curve recovery around 2008, Zimbabwe's GNI per capita bottomed out at an unfathomable $1,400.
It is hard to even picture that.
While the rest of the world was averaging around $15,000 to $16,000 at that time, they were surviving on an equivalent of $1,400 a year. But even the $3,511 figure for 2023 only tells us half the story, right?
Oh, absolutely. Averages can be incredibly deceptive.
Yeah, if you put 10 people in a room and 9 of them have absolutely nothing, but one person has $1 million, the average wealth in that room is $100,000.
But the lived reality is that 90% of the room is entirely destitute.
This is where the second pillar of our framework comes into play, the IHDI, the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index.
Hmm.
I look at national growth like baking a massive pie.
Okay, I like pie analogies.
Right. So the baseline HDI tells us the total size of the pie coming out of the oven. But the IHDI measures how much of that pie actually reaches the kitchen table for the average citizen to consume.
Hmm.
Because between the oven and the table, a huge chunk of that pie just evaporates.
And that evaporation is inequality.
Exactly. And the data indicates that Zimbabwe's pie is evaporating at an alarming rate.
Mm.
On a global scale, the average loss of HDI due to inequality is about 21.9%.
So worldwide, we lose a little over a fifth of our human development potential to unequal distribution.
But Zimbabwe's loss is a staggering 32.1%.
That is a punitive discount on their development. It means that when you adjust for the reality of inequality on the ground, Zimbabwe's actual lived human development isn't that 0.598 nominal score we talked about earlier.
It plummets to 0.406.
The 0.598 is a mirage.
Yeah, a complete mirage. And the research report provides a granular breakdown of this 32.1% loss, which basically acts as an autopsy of the country's inequality.
Right. If we look at the three main components based on 2023 data, we find that life expectancy inequality accounts for 22.3% of the drag.
Which tracks logically since we already established that public health has been rebounding relatively universally across the population over the last 20 years.
Huh.
What about the education sector?
Education inequality accounts for a remarkably low 14.6% of the drag.
Wow, that's surprisingly low.
It is. And again, this aligns perfectly with the data we explored earlier regarding the high mean years of schooling. The educational infrastructure, impressively, is widely accessible. It functions as the great equalizer in Zimbabwean society.
So if the problem isn't health distribution, and it isn't education distribution, that really leaves one massive culprit.
Income inequality. It accounts for a massive 52.9% of the total human development loss.
Over half.
Yes. More than half of all the potential loss to inequality is strictly due to the fact that the financial capital is heavily hoarded at the very top of the economic pyramid.
So to synthesize what we've discovered so far, you have an incredibly educated population. Millions of citizens with roughly 9 years of schooling who are fully capable of driving an advanced economy forward.
Yes, the potential is there.
But this intellectual capital cannot convert into economic power because the financial infrastructure is profoundly top-heavy. The wealth simply isn't circulating down to the educated masses. The fuel line to the engine is completely blocked.
It is the defining bottleneck of their economy. And knowing that extreme income inequality is draining the country's potential, we have to look much closer at exactly who is being locked out.
Right, we need to look at the demographic split to see who bears the heaviest burden of this structural failure.
Which brings us to the third pillar of our data, the gender indices. We need to compare the Gender Development Index, the GDI, against the Gender Inequality Index, the GII.
And I've got to say, the contrast between these two data sets is, frankly, heartbreaking.
It really is. Let's begin with the area of success. The GDI measures gender gaps in human development achievements by looking at health, education, and command over economic resources.
Right, and a score of 1.0 would indicate perfect parity between men and women.
Correct. In 2023, Zimbabwe achieved a remarkably high GDI value of 0.944.
That is incredibly close to parity. And when you dig into the education subdata within the GDI, the success is so obvious. The expected years of schooling for young girls entering the system is 10.7 years. For boys, it's 11.4 years.
The gap is practically negligible.
Yeah. And the mean years of schooling, the actual time adults have spent in the classroom, shows a highly competitive ratio of 8.3 years for women against 9.7 years for men.
What this data proves is that within the confines of the school system, Zimbabwe has engineered a high degree of gender equality. Young women are accessing education at nearly the same rate as young men.
The school system essentially functions as a protected space of empowerment and intellectual parity.
But the crucial question is, what happens when those young women graduate?
Right, when they step out of that protected space of the classroom and try to enter society and the workforce.
To answer that, we have to switch from the GDR to the GII, the Gender Inequality Index. While the GDI measures achievement, the GII measures the human development costs of gender inequality.
Specifically looking at reproductive health, empowerment, and labor market participation.
Yes, and the numbers on reproductive health here completely shocked me.
Mine too. Let's look at the adolescent birth rate. This tracks the number of births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 19. If we pull up the global average, it sits at 39.1 births per 1,000 adolescent women.
But in Zimbabwe, that number skyrockets to 94.1.
It is substantially more than double the global average.
It's a huge barrier.
I want to use an analogy here to explain the economic damage of this because it's not just a social issue, it's a macroeconomic failure.
Good.
Imagine a factory assembly line. You've spent 10 years meticulously building a highly advanced high-tech engine. That's the education system, creating this brilliant young woman.
Okay.
But the moment the engine comes off the assembly line, instead of installing it into a car to drive the economy forward, you leave it sitting out in the rain to rust.
Wow. That's a powerful way to look at it.
Before this highly educated young woman even turns 20, the mathematical probability that she will be thrust into motherhood is overwhelming. And the moment that happens, her ability to enter an already constrained, top-heavy labor market is severely, if not permanently, compromised.
Your assembly line analogy is painfully accurate, and it becomes even more dire when we factor in the medical realities of that early motherhood. The GDI also tracks the maternal mortality ratio.
And those numbers are rough.
Globally, the average is 216 deaths per 100,000 live births. In Zimbabwe, the maternal mortality rate sits at an alarming 356 per 100,000.
It is an absolute tragedy. You have a system that successfully educates young women, but the social and medical realities waiting for them outside the schoolhouse doors immediately strip them of their agency.
Adolescent pregnancy, a severe lack of maternal health care, early marriage.
You are basically taking half of your highly educated intellectual stockpile and systematically severing them from the labor force.
And if we connect this back to the extreme income inequality we discussed earlier, the mechanics of the poverty trap become very clear.
How so? Connect those dots for us.
Well, the wealth is concentrated among an elite few. The labor market is subsequently very tight. And young women, despite their equal education, are structurally funneled into high-risk health scenarios and early domestic roles rather than the formal economy.
The school system empowers them intellectually, but society immediately disempowers them economically.
Exactly. So we've built a very detailed macro profile of Zimbabwe's development over the last 30 years. We see an educated population recovering from a historical health collapse, but paralyzed by severe wealth hoarding and structural gender barriers.
But terms like GNI per capita and IHDI loss can feel abstract. They prove the economic struggle is real, but they don't tell us what that struggle actually feels like.
We need a micro perspective to understand the day-to-day reality of the people living inside these statistics.
To provide that micro perspective, the research report utilizes the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. And this metric, using data from 2019, fundamentally shifts how we look at poverty.
It moves beyond the simple binary question of, how many dollars do you earn a day?
Right. Instead, it measures specific deprivations. It asks what essential things are missing from your daily life. It defines poverty as a lack of fundamental living standards.
Because poverty isn't just a low bank balance, it's an empty pantry. It's a dark house when the sun goes down.
Exactly. The MPI breaks down the exact deprivations dragging the population down. And looking at the 2019 data, the single heaviest contributor to multidimensional poverty in Zimbabwe is nutrition, which accounts for 18.7% of the total MPI.
That indicates a chronic caloric deficit and a lack of dietary diversity, which immediately impacts cognitive function, immune resilience, and physical labor capacity.
It's a foundational issue.
But the second heaviest contributor is what I find most revealing about infrastructural poverty. Cooking fuel accounts for 12.7% of the poverty index.
This is a data point I really want to pause and expand on, because I think listeners in highly developed nations might struggle to conceptualize the macroeconomic ripple effect of this.
Well, that's a fair point.
When the report says a lack of cooking fuel, it doesn't mean people can't afford their monthly gas bill. It means they have to rely on gathering wood, charcoal, or dung just to cook a meal.
Let's walk through a day in the life of someone dealing with this.
Yeah, say you are one of those highly educated young women we talked about. You have 9 years of formal schooling, you understand mathematics, history, and science. But if your home has no electricity or clean cooking fuel, you have to wake up and spend 4 to 6 hours every single day walking miles to secure solid fuel, chopping wood, carrying it back, and tending a smoky fire just to boil water to make it safe to drink and to cook a basic meal.
And that takes up half the day.
Right. If you are spending 6 hours a day securing basic caloric survival, you cannot start a business. You cannot take a full-time job. You cannot leverage your 9 years of education. Time is the ultimate unrenewable resource, and infrastructural poverty steals your time.
That is a brilliant synthesis. The time deficit created by a lack of basic infrastructure absolutely paralyzes economic mobility. Money alone cannot fix this.
No, it can't.
If the national grid doesn't supply electricity to your region, having an extra $10 in your pocket doesn't change the fact that you still have to go chop wood to survive. It is a structural lockout.
And the labor of fetching that wood and water almost universally falls on women and girls, which ties directly back to our gender data.
Which also explains the third biggest contributor to the MPI.
School attendance drop-offs, which sits at 11.9%.
Precisely. The pieces all connect, the schools are there, and early attendance is high. But eventually, the compounding pressures of adolescent pregnancy, combined with the sheer time-consuming necessity of securing basic survival resources like wood and water, force a significant portion of the population to drop out.
They drop out before they can capitalize on their educational foundation. So the picture is brutally clear. We have a highly educated population entirely hamstrung by top-heavy wealth distribution, severe gender roadblocks, and infrastructural poverty defined by a lack of modern amenities like electricity and clean fuel.
Which brings us back finally to the mind-bending hook of this entire deep dive.
The green paradox, because the question we have to answer is how on earth does this struggling profile, this reality of chopping wood and lacking nutrition, translate into an environmental triumph on the global stage?
The mechanism behind this paradox is the fourth and final pillar of our framework, the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
The revelation in the 2023 data here is staggering. The PHDI essentially asks two questions of every country. How much carbon are you emitting per person, and how much raw material are you extracting from the Earth per person?
Let's establish the world average first.
Okay, lay it out.
In 2023, the global average for per capita carbon emissions was 4.54 tons. Regarding the material footprint, which measures the total amount of biomass, fossil fuels, metal ores, and non-metallic minerals consumed, the global average is 12.7 tons per person.
Now consider Zimbabwe's numbers, their carbon emissions. A mere 0.67 tons per person. Their material footprint, just 3.1 tons.
The contrast is astronomical. 4.54 tons of CO2 globally versus 0.67 tons in Zimbabwe. They're placing virtually zero pressure on the planetary boundaries compared to the developed world.
And because of that minuscule footprint, when the United Nations applies the PHDI filter to the global rankings, the entire world order flips upside down.
It really does.
Wealthy nations, the ones sitting at the top of the HDI list, with massive wealth, huge houses, and long life expectancies, they get heavily penalized. Their scores plummet because the math reveals that their wealth is entirely built on carbon gluttony and massive material extraction.
But Zimbabwe's score barely moves. Because their planetary pressure is virtually non-existent, applying the PHDI filter only drops their score by a tiny fraction.
Moving from a nominal HDI of 0.598 to a PHDI of 0.585.
And because everyone else above them is falling like rocks, Zimbabwe magically jumps 8 spots up the global ranking. They leapfrog other nations simply by not destroying the biosphere.
But I have to be brutally honest here. I want to push back on the framing of this UN metric.
Go for it.
Are we really supposed to view this as an eco-friendly utopia? Doesn't this mean the metric is slightly broken if it inherently rewards poverty?
That's a very valid critique.
I mean, we just spent 20 minutes discussing how 12.7% of their multidimensional poverty is tied to a lack of cooking fuel. It feels incredibly cynical to praise a country for having a zero-carbon footprint simply because millions of its citizens can't afford electricity and have to chop wood.
Your cynicism is entirely justified, and to be fair, the research report does not gloss over this reality. Development economists have a specific term for this phenomenon. They call it forced green, or the green paradox.
Forced green, meaning they didn't choose it.
Exactly. Zimbabwe's incredibly low emissions are not the product of advanced technological evolution. Their footprint isn't low because the government successfully transitioned to a highly efficient, progressive smart grid powered by wind and solar energy.
Right.
Their low footprint is the direct, unavoidable side effect of deindustrialization, an underpowered economy, and the infrastructural poverty you just described.
They aren't emitting carbon because their industrial engines are stalled. They aren't extracting a massive material footprint because the financial capital simply isn't there to mine the resources. It is poverty masquerading as sustainability.
That is the dark side of the paradox. However, I want to challenge you to look at the other side of that coin. We cannot let the developed world off the hook here.
Okay, I'm listening.
Because while Zimbabwe's green status is undoubtedly forced, this data serves as an absolute, undeniable indictment of the global high-energy development model.
Walk me through that. How does Zimbabwe's poverty indict our development?
Look at the wealthy nations that plummet in the PHDI rankings. The data mathematically proves that their high HDI, their long life expectancies, their massive wealth, their advanced educational infrastructure was almost entirely purchased by borrowing against the ecological future of the planet.
Ah, I see.
If reaching a high standard of living inherently requires emitting 5, 10, or 15 tons of carbon per person, then the entire global metric of what constitutes success is deeply fundamentally flawed.
Oh, wow. Yeah. We look at a country ranked 153rd, and our immediate reaction is they need to develop to be like us.
Right.
But if being like us inherently requires destroying the biosphere that sustains human life on Earth, then our definition of development is effectively a suicide pact.
Precisely. The green paradox forces us to realize that the global north has not actually figured out human development either. They have merely figured out how to temporarily outsource the ecological cost of their development to future generations.
That's haunting.
It is. Zimbabwe may be underdeveloped economically, but the data suggests the West is maldeveloped ecologically.
That is a profound paradigm shift. So taking all of this in the bizarre, contradictory mix of a highly educated population, a recovering life expectancy, severe income hoarding, gender bottlenecks, and this forced green paradox that basically subsidizes the carbon gluttony of the West.
It's a lot to process.
It is. How does a country with this profile actually move forward? How do they reshape their growth to escape the paradox?
Well, the research report concludes by outlining 3 data-backed steps, actionable pathways to turn this complex reality into genuine, resilient development.
Let's lay them out. What is step 1?
Step 1 is eliminate the loss. The data clearly identified that 52.9% of the country's development loss is due strictly to income inequality.
Right, the pie evaporating.
Exactly. Zimbabwe already has the intellectual stockpile. They don't need to build the education system from scratch. To unlock the economic potential of that highly educated population, structural reforms must aggressively target wealth distribution.
So spread the wealth.
Yes. The capital must be allowed to flow to the educated masses rather than remaining trapped at the top of the economic pyramid.
You already have the high-performance engine. You just have to unblock the fuel line so the gas can actually reach it. Okay, what is step 2?
Step 2 is to implement radical social safety nets, targeted specifically at the gender divide. The GDI data is undeniable. The government and international partners must drastically reduce the adolescent birth rate and drastically improve maternal health infrastructure.
Stop the leaks in the assembly line.
Yes. A nation cannot afford to lose half of its intellectual and labor capital to the medical vulnerabilities and societal roadblocks of early marriage and adolescent pregnancy. Freeing up female potential is mathematically the highest yield investment the country can make.
If the young women are matching the young men in the classroom, society has to ensure the structural pathways exist so they can match them in the boardroom. Makes total sense. And step 3.
Step 3 is leverage the green paradox, and this relies on international diplomacy. Because Zimbabwe emits so little carbon, they are effectively subsidizing the carbon budget of the Western world.
They're leaving atmospheric space for wealthy nations to continue emitting.
Exactly. Zimbabwe must use its impressive 8-spot PHDI ranking leap as leverage on the global stage.
But how do they actually monetize that leverage?
By demanding international climate compensation and targeted green investment. They need to approach the global community and say, we are absorbing the ecological cost of your wealth. In exchange, you must invest in our leapfrog technology.
Ah, so skip the dirty phase.
Right. They need to bypass the dirty fossil fuel industrialization phase entirely and use international green funds to build solar grids, sustainable agriculture, and clean infrastructure. They must actively turn a forced green penalty into a green dividend.
Turn the paradox into a dividend. That is a brilliant strategic roadmap. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, from the U-shaped health collapse and recovery to the unexpected intellectual stockpile, the evaporating pie of income inequality, the tragic bottlenecks of maternal health, and finally, the profound philosophical questions raised by the green paradox.
It's an incredibly rich data set.
It really is. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this incredibly complex, data-heavy journey. If there is one undeniable takeaway from the 1990 to 2023 data, it is the profound, almost unimaginable resilience of the Zimbabwean people.
Absolutely.
They have maintained a commitment to education and survival through circumstances that would have fractured most other nations.
It is a level of human resilience that demands to be matched by systemic change, both internally regarding wealth distribution and globally regarding climate equity.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Something to explore on your own as you digest the numbers we've unpacked today. We started this deep dive by looking at a ranking system that suddenly penalized environmental destruction, causing wealthy nations to plummet while a struggling nation rose.
The great inversion.
Right. If the ultimate test of human evolution, the true, final definition of development, is to achieve a high quality of life without rendering the Earth uninhabitable, who is really underdeveloped?
That is the question.
Is it the nation with the low income, the high education, and the tiny ecological footprint? Or is it the wealthy nations who have borrowed their prosperity from the planet's future, relying entirely on an economic model that literally cannot be sustained for another century? Maybe, just maybe, the developed world has a lot more to unlearn than the developing world has to learn.